don't forget it. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. Let me just skip to the model that Dawn hasn't presented. So this paper is trying to see how the different tools of activists interact with focus on communication behind the scenes, and the idea is that there are two possible actions. Okay, there's some status quo action that's going to lead to some status quo income, which is somewhere here, and there's some change action, something new, something that you can change that's going to lead to some uncertain outcome. Either it's going to decrease the value of the firm or it's going to increase the value of the firm. That's basically the basic setup. There are three players in this game, a board, passive shareholders, and an activist. And the board cares only about the value. So the board, and the shareholders care only about the value. Okay, so if this change action is going to increase the value, they want change. If now they want to keep the status quo. The board, as Dawn has presented, has some incentive to stay the status quo. So even if it's going to increase the value somehow to make some change, they still want to have a status quo. And the activist has the opposite preferences, at least in the paper. Dawn didn't really present it, and he has some preference for change. So even if change is going to decrease the value of the firm by somehow, he still prefers change. So those are pretty much their preferences. And the key is that the activist also knows what change is going to do. Okay, and others don't. Now, as Dawn mentioned, what define the interesting part is where the board and the activist have opposite preferences. The board wants status quo and the activists want change, but it's important that we have those zones where they agree. Okay, if we don't have those zones or they're too small, there can't be any communication. So we need that. And the model is as follows. First, the investor kind of makes some recommendation, the activists make some recommendation to the board about the action that they should find. It's just cheap talk. The board can follow the recommendation or ignore it. And choose the action, status quo change. Then the investor can either exit, can sell all its shares, and there's some probability they're going to be forced to do that. It's not that important now. Or you can choose avoid that is some launch some costly campaign among shareholders that, and if he wins, is going to change or kind of overturn the decision of the board. If he doesn't, then the board continues to control, or of course the investor can do nothing. Okay, that's basically the game. And what are the results? So first of all, not always there's not necessarily always the communication between the activist and the board, as I've shown before. If they disagree by much, there cannot be any communication. And in an equilibrium without communication, the board simply does what it thinks is the right thing, and the investor exits if the firm is overpriced. And in that case, exit kind of is bad news. Okay, if I see an exit of an activist, I know that probably the value of the firm is actually going to be low. This is a bad sign for me. However, if the investor decides not to exit and invoke a campaign that is use voice, then that's actually the opposite. Now I understand that actually the firm at least has the potential of having a high value. So this is kind of a positive signal, and that actually makes the campaign more successful. And in that sense, the voice and exit work together, and in this there could be multiple equilibria, not interesting. One thing that I was asking myself when I read the paper was whether is there a chance that the board is going to choose change, and the activist is actually going to campaign for no change, for status quo. I think that it's possible in this model. Is it reasonable in general? That's one question. There's another equilibrium. Actually, the board is doing, it follows the recommendation of the activist, And the one shows that in such equilibrium, a campaign is never launched, okay? But the threat of the activists to launch a campaign actually plays an important role in the fact that the board decides to follow his recommendation. And another thing that is important here is that suppose the incentives of the activists to exit increase because the price that he can get in the market for his shares is higher, that's actually something that is going to improve communication, simply because the board knows that the activist has less incentive to do some manipulation because it can always act. He has some high outside option, and that actually increases the possibility of communication. However, higher price also has some effect on the probability that he's going to launch a campaign. So the overall effect is kind of more nuanced, and you can find it in the paper. My overall assessment is that this is a very good paper, okay? The model is very clean, and it's very tight in the sense that it's a complicated model on one hand. It has lots of moving parts. I would definitely not recommend adding something to it. So I'm not going to recommend extensions or something like that. On the other hand, almost everything is needed in order to get the results. And therefore, it's not surprising to find out that this paper is quite mature. But I think that my comments are mostly about at least a little things that you can change in the model and about the presentation. And now I'm in a tough situation because Dawn haven't presented the model. So I'm not going to say all my comments, which we leave some of those comments for the private communication that Dawn said is more efficient. There's no reason for you to share. But let me start by, so again, at least in the paper, although Dawn hasn't presented it, the activist has some incentive, has some preference for change, and it actually prefers change sometimes even when that decreases the value of the firm. So one thing that was missing for me was kind of trying to explain why is it happening? Is it also in the next version of the paper, or that's something you need to somehow defend? But again, and another thing is that an activist can now exit even if after change was chosen. So what can happen in this model is that an activist will launch a campaign to do some change. The board will win the proxy fight. The firm will do the change, and then he just exit. An important point is that he can do that even though change actually is going to decrease the value of the firm. Okay, so he's winning the proxy fight. The firm goes to some direction which is actually decreases its value, and investor exits. And I was reading it and I was thinking, is that a reasonable equilibrium? And if it's something we believe that can happen, maybe that's something that we should regulate. Maybe somehow we should impose some limitations of exit for activists or something like that. I think that can be a possible message of the paper. Another thing is communication. What do you mean when you say communication? So again, the interaction here between the activist and the board involves a carrot and a stick. The carrot is the fact that the activist knows something the board doesn't and kind of gives her information. And the stick is that he has a threat and he's saying, if you do not do what I recommend, I will launch a campaign, and if I win, then you're going to lose your job or something else, okay? And the way the paper is written right now, those two effects are both labeled as effective communication. And when Dawn says voice complements communication, it basically means that if the gun that you put on the table is larger, then there's a higher chance that the board is going to do as you recommended. But that's not exactly as I define communication, or maybe that's the way we define communication in the Middle East, but not in other places. So I would I think that it would be useful to try and differentiate between those two things, especially because they are important for welfare. Because when there's more communication from the activists to the board, that actually increases the value for the shareholders. When the threat is more effective, that's not necessarily so. Okay, that sometimes, especially because the activist has some incentive to decrease the value of the firm as long as there's change, then giving more power to the activist doesn't necessarily good for the shareholders. So maybe analyzing some benchmark model when the activist cannot have a voice, which is, now I understand is the original version of the paper, or have some equilibrium where just the activist always says what he prefers, no matter, kind of he's not strategic, just says what he prefers, whether he prefers change or status quo, and you see what the board listens to, the kind of disentangling, that's something that is useful. Again, my last comment was about presentation. I think that the propositions in the paper that were not presented here are very complicated and can be simplified, but again, that's something I'm going to leave for public communication. Overall, this is a very good paper which I really enjoyed reading, and I think that the next version is going to be great, probably going to be published, so in your RFS soon. Thank you.
You did a great job. So would you like to respond something?
Yeah, I just want to say a couple of things. Thank you very much for the great discussion. I assume everyone is just tired and hungry, right? That's so all my strategy of not presenting any math didn't work. I tried for all the equations. But anyway, so a couple of things. One is there's a very precise definition in my model for effective communication, which is transmission of information. That's how so information can be revealed in equilibrium, that's to me effective communication. And it's a good question, what's the difference between communication and negotiation? So here I take the opportunity to actually advertise one of my students who's going to the market this year with sort of a paper about activist settlement. And there it's really about negotiation, not about communication. And I think partially because negotiation is about a contract. And there are different ways to think about what kind of contract activists and firms sort of get into. But communication is about transmission of information per se, nothing else. So there is a definition for that. The other thing, maybe just one last comment, is about, because that was repeated several times, whether an activist is pushing for a value decreasing proposal. Everything works when the activist is sort of maximizing shareholder value. And I think it's a good way to edit the benchmark. I guess working on activism, oftentimes you hear people, not like Alon and Babchuk, but maybe they're like Lipton and others, that activists are value destroying and so on and so forth. So actually in this paper, I didn't want to take a stand about whether activists are value increasing or value destroying. They could have preferences which are opposed to management or opposed to shareholders. And communication can still be effective to some extent. So it's not so much about the normative implication, should we have activists or not. It's more like activists can have their own agenda, not necessarily maximizing shareholders' value. Still dialogues can take place, and it's interesting to see what the model might predict. So this is how I view it, but I agree. I mean, maybe this is just for marketing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes the first day. And now we get to the fun part, to take our luggage and go to the bus. Thank you for